Almost nothing gets to me more than the end of The Return of the King.
Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!
And what distinguishes Tolkien's writing from other fantasy stories here is that when it comes to the moment of truth, the hero fails.
The ring is mine.
For all the way he has come from the Shire, Frodo can't cast the ring into the fires. In fact, he takes it for himself. But it got me thinking, why did Tolkien write it this way? And today's video is brought to you by me and my book on writing and world building, which compiles all of my writing and world building videos into one single, easy to reference, easy to read book. It actually has quite a lot of Lord of the Rings stuff in here. The ebook is already out for you to pre-order down at the link below, and the actual paperback release is not till May 30th. So if you're keen, I'd really appreciate you going to get it. And thank you to the hundreds of you who already have. Now, when I say Frodo failed, I mean this in a very specific narrative sense. Frodo's failure is unique, but to explain why, we need to discuss primary and secondary conflicts in a narrative climax, which I discussed in my video on final battles. The secondary conflict is the visual or physical confrontation between characters. This might be an argument, the hero fending off an army like in Logan, or in the case of The Return of the King, Frodo and Gollum grappling on the precipice of a volcano. The primary conflict, on the other hand, is the internal conflict that a character has to overcome. In Logan, this was whether Wolverine could take responsibility, stop himself being isolated, and allow himself to be a part of another family. In The Return of the King, this is whether Frodo can resist the temptation of the One Ring in the heart of Sauron's power. Usually, these two layers of conflict are woven together, they work in tandem, and a lot of the time the hero actually succeeds in both, like Aang in Avatar: The Last Airbender, who retains his morality, the primary conflict, and defeats the Fire Lord, the secondary conflict. And in some more solemn stories, like Logan, the hero loses the secondary conflict, but they succeed in their primary conflict, which is the one that we typically see as more important or more meaningful. Logan chooses to care as part of a new family again, even if he dies in doing so. In contrast, Frodo succeeds in neither his primary nor his secondary conflict. Gollum successfully wrestles the One Ring from him, and Frodo doesn't manage to resist the lure of the One Ring. This isn't a narrative model that we usually see. The defeat is neither willing, nor is his capitulation to the One Ring a noble sacrifice, at least not directly. No, he succumbs to the One Ring, to the will of Sauron, to his most deepest and darkest desires in totality. So, the question becomes, why did Tolkien write it this way? Tolkien's dichotomous narrative, where there is a definitively good side and a definitively evil side, to the point that he described Sauron one time as close to a wholly evil mind as is possible, it stands out because it isn't providing a commentary on subjective human morality in the way that, say, George R. R. Martin is in his A Song of Ice and Fire series. No, Tolkien's stories are instead written to comment on the nature of good and evil themselves and how they relate to one another. And Frodo's failure in Mount Doom is perhaps the most important scene in discussing this. The first thing that Tolkien explores in this scene is the nature of evil. How is evil overcome? Is it something we defeat with good and moral acts, or resisting the draw to do evil things? The scene at the Crack of Doom suggests no. The irony of Sauron's defeat is that the very evil force that kept him alive, the desire that all feel for the One Ring, is what eventually causes his total defeat at Mount Doom. After Sauron's destruction, Isildur could not destroy the One Ring or resist taking it for himself. Yet in the climax of The Lord of the Rings, what causes the One Ring's destruction is that because Frodo and Smeagol are both utterly consumed by the evil in their hearts, fostered by the One Ring, they fight to the bitter end till Smeagol falls into the depths with it. But Gollum held aloft the ring, a finger still thrust within its circle. It shone now as it verily was wrought with a living fire, and with that, even as his eyes were lifted up to gloat upon his prize, he stepped too far, toppled, wavered for a moment on the brink, and then with a shriek he fell. Out of the depths came his last wail. "Precious! Precious! 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 I can't. I'm sorry. I've tried saying like that in a way that makes Gollum wail like, Precious! But I can't. I can't. And then he was gone. Jane Chance explained the nature of evil in the scene really well in her book. The scene at the Crack of Doom is one of immense moral ambiguity. Good does not triumph over evil, but depends on evil to deliver it. Tolkien's moral philosophy becomes clearer here, that good cannot always destroy evil, but evil will always destroy itself in the end. In particular, Tolkien uses my absolute favourite literary technique to explore this idea of evil being self-defeating. Literary symmetry. I have a weakness for it in all of its forms. There is a symmetry between the Battle of Dagorlad in 3441 of the Second Age and the Crack of Doom. There, the ring survived because man could not resist its evil. Here, the ring was destroyed because man could not resist its evil. And just as Sauron loses a finger in the moment of his defeat, he is defeated immediately after Frodo loses his finger. There's a cyclicalness here. Cyclicalness? That's not a word. The point being that the forces that make it go around the world, that cause it to transfer hands from Sauron to Isildur to Gollum to Bilbo to Frodo, bring it all the way back to Mount Doom. That it is self-defeating. But this point of tension further complicates Tolkien's ideas when we account for the power of one particular thing: mercy, which holds a precarious place in the story of The Lord of the Rings and the wider Tolkien legendarium, particularly in two moments in the story. Firstly, when Bilbo spares the life of Gollum in The Hobbit, and secondly, when Frodo spares Gollum in The Two Towers at the Forbidden Pool, and numerous times after that.
Shall I shoot? Wait. This creature is bound to me.
In The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien explicitly highlights the role of mercy in the overall narrative.
Pity. It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand.
It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he is bound up with the fate of the ring. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. This line, it seems, is almost prophetic, and mercy is shown to be an incredibly important force in the story. If Frodo and Bilbo each hadn't shown compassion and mercy to Gollum, he couldn't have been there in Mount Doom, and the ring would have never been destroyed. It seems that showing mercy matters, even if we fall to the temptation of evil. To Tolkien, the most important moral acts that we can take are not necessarily actively opposing evil people and forces like orcs, but doing moral things when nobody is watching. In Middle-earth, people won't remember that Frodo took mercy on Gollum. That won't go down in the tale of the ages, even though it's one of the most important moral acts that Frodo ever took to destroy the One Ring. They certainly won't remember that Bilbo took mercy on Gollum. Fundamentally, Tolkien is using this interplay of good and evil and mercy and temptation to say that even though evil will destroy itself, that doesn't mean we don't need to do good moral things. In The Lord of the Rings, mercy is an important virtue, even if it never punishes evil or converts it like we see in many other fantasy stories. In this case, the cause, not Frodo, was triumphant, because by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury, all was redressed and disaster averted. And the second thing that Tolkien does in this scene is he rejects the notion of the paragon, the idea that any person can be morally perfect. Hobbits have a remarkable ability to resist the One Ring, far more than men or elves or Maiar. This is partly because of their humility, but even here, the Hobbit who selflessly took it upon himself to destroy the ring and resisted its power, influence, and manipulation for so long, he too succumbs to its evil as well. To Tolkien, evil is all-corrupting in that it is an inherent part of the nature of man, and as a lore side note, hobbits are actually distantly related to the race of men, though we don't know any more than that. And it's interesting because Tolkien's theology bleeds into his work here. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, as Tolkien was a devout Catholic, it is written that original sin is a deprivation of original holiness and justice, but a human nature has not been totally corrupted. It is wounded, and the natural powers proper to it, subject to ignorance, suffering, and the dominion of death, and inclined to sin. To Tolkien, it's not that human nature is evil, as we see the characters of Aragorn, Sam, Frodo, and many others do morally good things, but that human nature is wounded. It's a struggle inside all of us, and this natural inclination of men and hobbits towards evil underpins how tension is built throughout the story, with the culmination of that tension in the scene at the Crack of Doom. Frodo isn't just resisting the One Ring, Tolkien sees him as resisting a part of his very nature, and on this he said, "One must face the fact, the power of evil in the world is not finally resistible by incarnate creatures, however good. It is possible for the good, even the saintly, to be subjected to a power of evil which is too great for them to overcome in themselves. But even he cannot overcome the evil deeply rooted in his heart." But Tolkien's rejection of the paragon goes even deeper than this. He goes on to say that I do not think that Frodo's failure was a moral failure. Moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. It is no more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been. Say, Frodo was crushed by a falling rock. We repeatedly see throughout the story characters interacting with the One Ring, some falling to it, some resisting it. There's tension because there is an ambiguity as to whether Frodo will be able to resist the One Ring in the end. After all, he's had it for a lot longer than most of these characters who have only interacted with it pretty briefly overall. And the one character who has interacted with it for an extended period of time, or the two if we include Bilbo, they're, well, The tension in the narrative feels like it's leading to a moment where someone is going to have to resist the evil of the One Ring once and for all to destroy it. And it does. But instead of Tolkien telling the reader that we should always be like Frodo and resist the temptation of evil as he casts the ring into the fires, Tolkien instead chooses to acknowledge our inherent flaws as humans. This is because Tolkien believes that there are some situations in which it is impossible for us to be truly moral, some moments that are just beyond us. Interestingly, this seems to be a subjective standard, that we all have different moral limits. And if we read this as kind of influenced or inspired by his experiences in war, it's understandable to see where this idea comes from. The idea that you can always and truly act morally when you're put in a stressful situation like a battlefield in World War I, it's understandable that in real life there may be situations where acting morally is just beyond us. What matters to Tolkien is that we strive to reach that moral limit, and that struggle itself is moral. This is why Aragorn and Legolas don't blame Frodo for giving in when they learn about it afterwards. They understand the reality of this. But this is only half the story. Understanding this idea of moral limits is important, but the text also reflects another part of Tolkien's Catholicism, that moral limits are met with an even more powerful redemptive force in the grace of God. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says as much. The victory that Christ won over sin has given us greater blessings than those which sin had taken from us. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Frodo sees himself as a failure in the text because he gave in at the moment of truth. But Eru, the creator god in Tolkien's mythos, still welcomes him when he sails to the Grey Havens. Once again, the importance of mercy comes through, that it is stronger than any wrong. Now, there are other meanings behind Frodo's leaving for the Grey Havens, especially in the lore, but this is one reading of the text that I think we should consider. Fundamentally, Tolkien rejects the idea of the paragon in Frodo not merely to say that man is naturally inclined towards evil, but to say that forgiveness cannot be earned through good works, that forgiveness is freely given and should be freely given. A very Christian idea. And the third thing that Tolkien does with this scene is that he scales down the scope of this epic story to the heart of the conflict, And I use the word epic in the traditional literary sense of being a grand, world-spanning tale. Tolkien's works aren't about the clashes of mighty armies or heroes on the battlefield. He subverts this fantasy trope in that the Battle of Morannon at the Black Gate is literally intended as a distraction from the real battle, which is not only taking place in Mount Doom, but taking place in Frodo's heart. To Tolkien, the battle of good and evil in our world isn't one between wholly good and wholly evil people, like the Men of the West and orcs. It takes place in the hearts and minds of all men. And the most important moments in our struggle against evil are not public grand acts of heroism and courage in battle, but subtle decisions to show mercy and resist evil that few see. The secret caves for Bilbo, the hidden pool for Frodo, and finally, the crack of doom. And in a more grounded sense, because I think this is important to discuss, Tolkien also wanted to touch on how the traumas of war stay with us. That when the war is over and we come home, the war doesn't vanish, or the effects of the war, the pains of the war don't just leave. Tolkien had direct experience of this as a soldier in the First World War, particularly in the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles in the war, where he saw friends of his die. And this kind of idea is most clearly demonstrated in Frodo. There is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest? This idea of being permanently changed by war and trauma is physically manifested in how Frodo loses a finger, a physical manifestation of the deeper and greater psychological wounds that he will never recover from. Necessarily, I also have to address the Tolkien-hated Allegory comment, which I'm sure someone didn't even finish the video and is going to comment down below anyways. Now, it is true, Tolkien did say, "I cordially dislike Allegory in all of its manifestations," but this line is often misinterpreted. He disliked overt and childish allegory. This is one of the reasons he wasn't a huge fan of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia.
Jesus Christ.
Where it sort of imposes on the reader how they should be interpreting this. This isn't to say that you can't have inspirations or draw on philosophical ideas or parallels between other things and your own work. He even stated at one point that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally Catholic work, unconsciously at first and then consciously in the revision. In other words, he made his work purposefully very Catholic. And for the reasons we've discussed today, that should be pretty obvious why. And there's a lot more in it than obviously I discussed. So yes, we can definitively read philosophical and religious understandings from the text. Don't make that mistake. But another question is, what can we as writers learn from this? Well, this is an example of the Dark Lord trope being used to actually enrich the text. And the Dark Lord trope we are often advised to stay far, far away from. And this is because Tolkien was not so much concerned with what is right and what is wrong, but how good and evil as concepts relate to one another. A really interesting question to ask. And the reason that I think that many of the stories that came afterwards failed to capture the magic of The Lord of the Rings is because even though they copied the tropes of the story, they didn't understand the philosophy and ideas and how these tropes work together to give the text a deeper meaning. Oftentimes the Dark Lord will just be a manifestation of evil, and that's it. Nothing more. And The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Legendarium more broadly is less about individual characters and their stories, and more about one grand tale and mythology, which has ideas and philosophies artistically woven into it. And I think this is best summed up in some of the closing lines of The Lord of the Rings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of the dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted. And together through ages of the world, we have fought the long defeat. The long defeat. I really like that phrase. It's a phrase that means fighting a noble but impossible battle. Noble because it is impossible. Doing good even if all will come to dust in the end. Because ultimately, all will come to dust. This is the struggle of Middle-earth. but it is also the struggle of mankind. Tolkien calls this the true theory of nobility and heroism, to do good, even if we fall eventually like Frodo. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is today's video. Remember, go get on writing and world building if you would like it. Lots of other Lord of the Rings and fantasy nuggets like that, because I love doing this sort of analysis. It is a writing book. It does compile all of the videos and scripts and everything, plus a whole bunch of new stuff that you've never seen before, which is really cool. It would mean the world if you went and picked it up. It's only $5. If you're waiting for the paperback, May 30th, mark it in your calendar. Also, come follow me on Instagram. That's where I live stream. I'm going to be live streaming at some point in the next little while, because 400,000 subscribers. Leave your links, leave your questions down below for a Q&A. I'll be doing that then. Really? Never mind. Okay. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.